The morning Evelyn Ashford arrived at Mercer Ranch, half the town of Caldwell Flats had turned out to watch, not to welcome her, but to see how long she'd last. She stepped down from the stage with two heavy leather trunks, a pair of reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of posture that said she'd spent years refusing to apologize for the space she occupied. The dress she wore was practical wool, dark brown, the kind a woman buys to work in, not to impress anyone. The crowd took her in, her broad shoulders, her full figure, her unhurried movements, and the whispers started before her boots hit the dirt. "That's the bride?" Poor Colt. Old Harlan's really done it to him this time. "She'll be back in the city inside a month. You watch." Evelyn heard every word. She didn't flinch. She picked up the smaller of her two trunks herself, looked at the man sent to collect her, a ranch hand named Deke, who'd been staring at her boots with something between pity and embarrassment, and said, "The other one's heavy. You'll want both hands." Deke grabbed the trunk. They walked to the wagon without another word. If you've ever been the person everyone in a room has already decided against, before you've spoken, before you've proven a single thing, then you already know exactly what Evelyn Ashford felt on that road out of Caldwell Flats. And if you haven't, this story will show you what it costs a person to survive it. Don't go anywhere. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you know about strength. The will had been read 3 weeks earlier in the back office of a lawyer named Herschel Pratt, whose desk was so cluttered with papers that Colt Mercer had to move a stack of land surveys just to find a chair. Harlan Mercer had written the thing himself, in his own hand, which was still sharp and angular even at 74 years old. Herschel read it aloud in a flat, careful voice, the way men read things they expect to cause trouble. The ranch, all 4,000 acres of it, the cattle, the water rights, the equipment, the debts, went to Colt with one condition. Colt had to be married within 60 days of the reading of the will, and the woman he married had to be Evelyn Ashford of St. Louis, Missouri, the only daughter of Harlan's oldest friend, a man named Theodore Ashford, who had died 2 years prior. Colt sat in that chair for a long moment after Herschel finished reading. "He left me a bride." "He left you the ranch," Herschel said carefully. "The bride is the condition." "I don't even know this woman." "Your grandfather did. Apparently Theodore Ashford spoke of her often. Harlan believed she was—" Herschel glanced at the paper. "Precisely the kind of person the Mercer Ranch needs." Colt stood up. He was 28 years old, lean from a decade of outdoor work, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been set too tight for too many years. He'd spent the last 3 of those years watching the ranch slowly lose ground, drought eating the pasture, cattle prices falling, 2 of the best hands leaving for the silver mines up north. He'd been managing it all with the determination of a man who refuses to admit he's losing. He'd had plans, quiet ones. A woman in town named Clara Holt, a banker's daughter with a sweet disposition and absolutely no interest in cattle, who'd been looking at him in church the way a woman looks when she's made a decision. He'd been working up to asking her, now this. "What happens if I don't do it?" Colt asked. Herschel set down the paper. "The ranch goes to your cousin Douglas in Denver." Colt said nothing. Douglas Mercer was a man who had never saddled a horse in his life, and who would sell the property inside a year to the first land company that offered him enough to buy a decent suit. Colt left the office without another word. He rode back to the ranch in the kind of silence that isn't peaceful, the kind that's just anger with nowhere to go. He wrote the letter to Evelyn Ashford that night, at the kitchen table by lamplight. He wrote it the way a man fills out a form at the bank. No warmth, no pretense. He told her the terms of the arrangement, the condition of the ranch, and what he could offer: a home, a working share of whatever the land produced, and his name. He told her plainly that he had not chosen this, but that he intended to honor his grandfather's wishes if she was willing. He did not ask if she was. He asked if she would. There was a difference, and he knew it. He sent the letter anyway. Her reply came 10 days later. It was 2 sentences. "I understand the terms, and I accept them. I will arrive by the end of the month." No questions, no hesitation, no attempt to soften the arrangement or make it sound like anything other than what it was. Colt read it twice, folded it, and put it in the desk drawer. He told himself he felt nothing in particular. That was a lie. but it was the kind of lie a man tells himself enough times that it starts to feel like the truth. Evelyn Ashford had spent 26 years learning to read rooms the way other women learn to read faces. You had to, when your body made you the subject of every room you entered. She'd been a large girl, then a large young woman, and now a large woman of 26 who had stopped waiting for people to look past it and simply decided to be too useful to ignore. Her father had taught her that. Theodore Ashford had been a bookseller and amateur naturalist who believed that knowledge was the most reliable armor a person could carry. He'd given Evelyn access to everything on his shelves: agriculture, geology, animal husbandry, land management, engineering, and she'd read it all with the same appetite she brought to novels and correspondence. When her father died, the inheritance was modest, enough to live on for a while, not enough to build anything lasting. Evelyn had been considering her options: a teaching position, perhaps, or a role in one of the women's education societies that were beginning to take hold in the city, when the letter from Colt Mercer arrived. She read it 3 times. It was the most impersonal marriage proposal she had ever heard of, and she had heard of a few. Colt Mercer hadn't even bothered to dress it up. He'd laid out the terms like a man transferring property. She thought about that for 2 days. Then she thought about what her father had told her once, when she was 14 and crying because a boy at a party had said something cruel about her weight in front of a group of people who'd all laughed. Theodore Ashford had sat down beside her on the stairs and said very quietly, "Evelyn, the question is never what they think of you. The question is what you're going to build." She'd been building ever since. A failing ranch in the Western Territories with a man who didn't want her wasn't anyone's idea of an opportunity. But Evelyn had read enough about frontier land management to know that failing ranches usually failed for reasons that were fixable: bad water management, overgrazing, resistance to new methods, poor breeding stock. She'd also read enough about land law to know that water rights in drought country were worth more than the cattle themselves, if you knew what you had. She wrote back in 2 sentences because 2 sentences was all the situation required. She packed her trunks with 6 months of practical clothing and every agricultural and geological text she owned. She took the train west, then the stage south, and she arrived in Caldwell Flats on a Tuesday morning in late October to the open stares of people who had already made up their minds. She'd been prepared for that, too. Colt met her at the ranch gate, not in town. That was the first insult, though Evelyn filed it away without comment. He was taller than she'd expected, harder around the edges. He shook her hand the way you shake a business associate's hand when you'd rather not be in the meeting and said, "You made it." "I said I would," Evelyn said. He looked at her trunks, 2 large ones, and a canvas roll of papers and tools she'd brought separately, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, more like recalibration. He'd been expecting someone who brought hat boxes. "Deke'll take those in," he said. "I'll show you the house." The house was a large, solid structure that had once been cared for and wasn't anymore. The kitchen was functional, but cheerless. The main room had a fireplace that worked and furniture that needed attention. Evelyn walked through each room without comment, noting the drafts, the water stains on the ceiling over the east bedroom, the window latch in the kitchen that didn't seat properly. Colt watched her do it. "It's not what you're used to," he said. There was something in his voice, not apology, more like preemptive defense. "I grew up in a bookshop with a leaking roof," Evelyn said. "I'll manage." She chose the room at the back of the house, the one that looked out over the south pasture. Colt had clearly expected her to want the larger room at the front. She could see it in the small pause before he said, "Suit yourself." That evening, he showed her the ranch books. She suspected he did it as a test, or perhaps as a warning. The numbers were bad. 3 years of below-average rainfall had wrecked the grass on the north and east sections. Cattle numbers were down from what the ranch could theoretically support, but the remaining animals were underfed and the calving rate had dropped. There was a note from the bank in Caldwell Flats. The Mercer Ranch carried a significant loan that was due to be reviewed in 6 months. If they couldn't show improvement by spring, the bank would have grounds to call it. Colt set the ledger on the table between them and watched her read it. Evelyn read it carefully. Twice. She asked 2 questions, one about the grazing rotation schedule, one about the source of the primary water supply. Colt answered both with the brevity of a man who expected the questions to stop soon. They didn't. "What's the state of the springs on the north section?" she asked. Dry. Been dry 2 seasons. Springs don't go dry, Evelyn said. They get blocked. Has anyone looked at the channel? Colt stared at her. They're dry, Mrs. Mercer. The name sat between them like something neither of them had agreed to. Evelyn let it pass. I'd like to ride the north section tomorrow, she said. It's rough country. I can send Deke with you. I'd rather you came, she said. Not warmly, practically. You know the land better than anyone. I'll need you to show me what I'm looking at. Colt said nothing for a moment. Then he said, All right, sunrise. He went to bed. Evelyn stayed at the kitchen table with the ledger and her own notebooks for another 2 hours, working through what she'd read and adding to the land maps she'd begun assembling from public survey records she'd requested weeks before leaving St. Louis. She hadn't told Colt she'd done that. She hadn't told him a lot of things yet. The wedding had taken place 4 days after her arrival, in the office of a justice of the peace named Willard Coombs, who was clearly uncomfortable with the entire situation and who rushed through the ceremony with the speed of a man with somewhere more important to be. There were no guests. Colt had arranged for 2 of the ranch hands to serve as witnesses, which they did with the expressions of men who'd been asked to do something they'd be telling their wives about later. Evelyn wore her second-best dress, the dark blue one. She'd considered her best dress and decided against it. This wasn't that kind of occasion. Colt wore a clean shirt and a jacket that fit him well enough. He said his vows in a steady voice that meant nothing. She said hers in the same tone. When it was done, Willard Coombs shook both their hands and said, Congratulations, in a voice that suggested he didn't quite believe it himself. Outside, one of the witnesses, a young hand named Archie, who had the unfortunate quality of saying whatever crossed his mind, leaned over to the other and said, just loudly enough, You think she lasts the winter? Colt heard it. His jaw tightened. He said nothing. Evelyn heard it too. She signed the marriage document in her steady, clear hand, thanked Willard Coombs for his time, and walked out to the wagon. In the wagon on the way back, Colt said, Archie's got a loose mouth. Don't take it personal. I don't, Evelyn said. He didn't mean Mr. Mercer. She looked at him. I've been hearing versions of that my entire life. I stopped needing people to explain it away a long time ago. Colt went quiet. He kept his eyes on the road. After a while, he said, Colt, not Mr. Mercer. All right, she said. Colt. They rode the rest of the way in silence. It wasn't a comfortable silence, but it was at least an honest one. The morning they rode the north section together was cold, the kind of cold that comes in off the high plains before dawn and doesn't warm up much after. Evelyn wore her heaviest coat and a pair of leather work gloves her father had given her years ago. She'd learned to ride as a girl, in the city parks, on a succession of borrowed horses. She wasn't graceful on horseback. She was competent, which was better. Colt noticed. He'd clearly prepared himself for worse. They rode north along the fence line while he explained, with the economy of a man who doesn't expect to be understood, the history of the land, the old water channels, the sections that used to be the best grazing on the property before the drought years. He pointed out where the grass had come back partially and where it hadn't come back at all. Evelyn listened. She asked questions that surprised him. Not the questions of someone looking at a problem from the outside, but the questions of someone who'd read extensively about this particular kind of landscape. She asked about the soil composition in the dry sections. She asked whether the creek that ran along the eastern boundary was seasonal or permanent. She asked about the cattle breed he was running and whether he'd considered crosses. Each question earned a slightly longer pause before his answer. At the north section, she dismounted and walked the ground where the spring had been. It was a slight depression in the earth, choked with years of accumulated sediment and overgrown at the edges with the kind of brush that moves in when water stops moving through. She crouched down and examined the ground. She prodded the sediment with a stick she found nearby. She looked at the topography of the land rising to the north. This spring isn't dead, she said. It's diverted. See this ridgeline? She pointed. Something shifted the drainage pattern. Could be a rockfall. Could be deliberate interference. The water's going somewhere else. It can be brought back. Colt looked at the ridge. That would take work, she said. Yes, but not as much as you'd think if you do it in the right sequence. She stood. I'd want to dig a test channel before committing to anything, but I think this is recoverable. He looked at her for a long moment. She was standing in the middle of a dead spring bed with dirt on her gloves and her coat, Her hair loosened from the ride, her cheeks red from the cold, and she was telling him something his foreman had written off 2 seasons ago. "You've done this before?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I've read extensively about it, and the theory is sound." "Reading about it isn't the same as—" "No," she agreed. "It isn't. That's why I said I'd want to test it first." He didn't have an answer for that. They rode back in the same silence as before, but it was a different kind of silence now. Something had shifted very slightly, like the first degree of a change in wind direction. Not enough to notice yet if you weren't paying close attention. Evelyn was paying close attention. She always was. The trouble at dinner started in the bunkhouse, not the main house, but it reached Evelyn soon enough. 2 days after the North Section ride, she'd made the mistake, or what felt like a mistake in the moment, of stopping by the bunkhouse at the end of a workday to ask Deke a question about the eastern fence line. There were 4 other hands there: Archie, the loose-mouthed witness, a quiet older man named Briggs, a pair of brothers named Pete and Cal who'd been with the Mercer Ranch for 3 years. She'd asked her question. Deke had answered it straightforwardly enough. Then Archie had said, still not looking at her directly but loud enough for the whole room, "You planning on running this ranch yourself, Mrs. Mercer? Because Colt's got a system." "I'm aware," Evelyn said. "I've read the books." "Reading books and working land are 2 different things." "I know." She looked at him steadily. "Which is why I ask questions before making decisions." Archie smirked. It was the kind of smirk that had a whole crowd of people in it, everyone who'd ever looked at her and decided, without evidence, that she didn't belong. She walked back to the main house without showing anything. That night she heard Colt come in late, heard him moving through the kitchen, heard him stop. She knew he'd found the map she'd been working on. A detailed layout of the ranch spread across the kitchen table, annotated in her careful hand with notes on soil drainage, grazing patterns, water sources, fence conditions. She'd meant to put it away before he saw it. She hadn't moved fast enough. There was a long pause, then the sound of the lamp being turned up. Evelyn stayed in her room. She lay on her back in the dark and listened to the silence in the kitchen that meant he was reading what she'd written. After a long while, she heard him turn the lamp down, heard the chair push back, heard his boots on the floor as he walked to his room. He said nothing. She said nothing. But in the morning, when she came to the kitchen, the map was still on the table. He hadn't moved it. He'd set his coffee cup to the side of it, carefully, so as not to damage it. She stood there for a moment looking at that. Then she put the kettle on and got back to work. The map stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days before either of them mentioned it. Evelyn added to it each evening, small notations, corrections, measurements she'd taken during the day's riding. She marked the degraded fence sections in one color and the water-stressed grazing zones in another. She added elevation markings along the North Ridge using the survey documents she'd brought from St. Louis, cross-referencing them against the actual land as she walked it each afternoon until the cold drove her back inside. Colt would come in from the range, wash up, eat whatever Evelyn had put together. She cooked without ceremony, the way she did everything, producing food that was plain and filling and reliably on time. And then he'd sit across from the map and not quite look at it while he drank his coffee. She could feel him looking at it. She let him look. On the 4th morning, he said, without preamble, "The coloring on the east section, you've got it marked as recoverable." "I think it is," she said. "If the North Spring can be redirected, the moisture table on the east section should improve within 2 seasons. 2 seasons is a long time." "It is," she agreed. "But the alternative is continuing to lose ground every year, which means in 2 seasons you're worse off than you are now." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Briggs thinks you're planning to take over the operation." Evelyn looked up from her notebook. "Is that what Briggs thinks, or is that what you think?" Colt had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "It's what he said." "Briggs is welcome to his opinion," she said. "I'm trying to understand what I've married into, that's all." The word married landed with a small, flat weight between them, and neither of them picked it up. Colt stood, set his cup in the basin, and put his hat on. "I'm going to look at the north fence line today," he said. "You can come if you want." It wasn't an invitation exactly. It was something less than that, and slightly more. Evelyn closed her notebook. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. The drought that had been strangling Mercer Ranch for 3 years wasn't unusual in that part of the territory. Half the ranches within 40 miles were suffering through the same slow drying out. But what made the Mercer situation particular was a set of decisions Harlan had made in the last 2 years of his life that had compounded the damage. He'd held on to too much stock when the grass thinned instead of selling down early. He'd borrowed against the ranch's future to cover the feed costs when the pasture failed. And he'd trusted a range management system that had worked for 20 years and simply hadn't adjusted when the conditions changed. Colt had inherited all of it: the debt, the stock, the system, and the deep-woven instinct that the way Harlan had done things was the way things were done. This was the wall Evelyn kept running into. Not openly. Colt wasn't the kind of man who raised his voice or made dramatic declarations. His resistance was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to work against. He'd listen to what she said, consider it with the expression of a man reading a contract for hidden clauses, and then usually return to the approach he'd planned before she'd spoken. Not dismissively. More like a man who respected an argument but couldn't quite trust the person making it yet. Evelyn understood this. She found it frustrating, but she understood it. The morning they rode the north fence line together, she pointed out a section of posts that had been set at wrong intervals for the soil type, too shallow in ground that heaved in frost, which was why the same 100-yard section kept failing every spring. She explained the fix. Colt listened. He didn't commit to anything. That afternoon, she overheard him explaining the same problem to Deke, in slightly different terms, as if he'd worked it out himself. She stood outside the barn for a moment, listening. Then she went back to the house and continued mapping. She didn't say anything about it. This was a decision she made consciously, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. She was new here. She was unwanted here. The land and the men and the whole accumulated weight of how this ranch had always operated were arrayed against her, and the only currency she had was usefulness. If Colt needed to reframe her observations as his own before he could act on them, she could live with that. The fence would get fixed either way. What she couldn't live with was being disregarded entirely, and that, she was beginning to realize, was becoming a genuine risk. The cattle disease appeared in the third week of November, quietly at first, the way bad things tend to announce themselves. Briggs noticed it before anyone else. A handful of animals in the southern pasture showing signs of respiratory distress, moving slower than the rest, holding their heads in a way that suggested something was wrong in the chest. He told Colt. Colt rode down to look. Then he called in a man from town named Wharton, who served as the closest thing Caldwell Flats had to a large animal veterinarian, which was to say he'd seen a lot of sick cattle in his life and had opinions about what to do with them. Wharton looked at the animals and said he thought it was a lung infection moving through the herd. He recommended isolating the affected animals and treating them with a regimen he'd used before. He charged Colt for the visit and the medicine and drove back to town in a wagon that squeaked badly and needed a new axle. Evelyn had been present for all of this. She'd stood at the fence rail and watched Wharton examine the cattle, and she'd asked him one question that he'd answered dismissively and then ignored. Her question had been about the water source for the southern pasture. That evening she pulled 3 texts from her trunk: a volume on bovine disease management, a survey of frontier livestock conditions, and a pamphlet from an agricultural station in Kansas that she'd sent away for several months before leaving St. Louis. She read until the lamp burned low. In the morning she told Colt that she thought the water in the southern pasture tank was contaminated. The tank was fed by a channel from the creek, and there was a section upstream where an old tanning operation, she'd seen the ruins of the building on one of her rides, had been dumping waste for years before it closed. That kind of contamination didn't clear itself. It settled in the sediment and kept poisoning anything that drank there. Colt heard her out. Then he said, "Wharton said it's a lung infection." "Wharton didn't look at the water," Evelyn said. "He knows cattle." "I know water," she said quietly. "And I know what the research says about contaminated groundwater and its effects on livestock respiratory systems. They present similarly to infection. If you treat for infection when it's actually contamination, you'll lose money on medicine and you won't fix the problem." Colt looked at her. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was holding something back, tightening at the hinge, a small betrayal of what was going on behind his eyes. "I'll talk to Wharton again," he said. He did. Wharton said he'd been doctoring cattle for 20 years and he knew a lung infection when he saw one. Colt reported this back to Evelyn with the careful expression of a man delivering news he expects to be contested. She didn't contest it. She asked him to move the affected animals to a pen fed from the well water, not the tank, as a precaution while the medicine ran its course. Just to see. Colt agreed to that. It was small enough that he could agree to it without feeling like he was choosing her over Wharton. 2 weeks later, the animals on well water were recovering. 3 new animals showing the same symptoms, still drinking from the southern tank, were getting worse. Colt stood at the fence, looking at those 3 animals for a long time. Evelyn stood beside him. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "Show me where this tanning operation was," he said, finally. The discovery of the contaminated water source solved one problem and revealed 2 more. Redirecting the southern pasture water supply required digging new channel runs and establishing a secondary pump feed from the well system, work that took 10 days, cost money they didn't easily have, and required all 4 hands plus Colt and Evelyn working from first light until the cold made it impossible to continue. It also meant moving the southern herd to the already strained middle pasture, which meant the middle pasture was now supporting more animals than it was designed to handle. And through all of it, Evelyn was the one who had identified the problem, designed the solution, and drawn the channel layout that they were all now digging with pickaxes in the November ground. Every man on the property knew this. Colt knew it. What none of them quite knew what to do with it was a separate question. Archie, to no one's surprise, handled it badly. It happened on the 6th day of the channel work, when Evelyn was directing a section of the dig from the edge of the channel, while Archie and Pete worked below. She'd told Archie to angle the cut 3 degrees further east to match the slope of the terrain. Archie had looked up at her standing there on the bank with her notes and her measuring rod, her coat muddy at the hem, her hair escaping its pins from a full day of outdoor work, and he'd said it loud enough for the whole crew to hear. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Mercer, but I've been digging channels since before you could read those books you carry around. I think I know which direction water runs." The crew went quiet. Pete stopped working. Briggs, 20 feet down the channel, looked up. Evelyn looked at Archie for a moment. She kept her voice level and completely matter-of-fact. "You're right that you've dug more channels than I have," she said. "But if we don't angle this cut east, the winter runoff will back up into the pump feed, and we'll have the same problem in March that we spent 10 days fixing in November. Dig it my way or explain to Colt why we're out here again in 3 months." Archie's jaw worked. He looked at Pete. Pete very carefully went back to digging. Archie dug it her way. He didn't like her any better for it. But he dug it correctly, and when the channel was complete and the water ran clean the first time they tested it, Evelyn noticed he'd gone quiet in a different way than before. Not friendly, not converted, but the particular kind of quiet that means a man has filed something away. Briggs, on the other hand, sought her out that evening. He was a taciturn man, Briggs, a former Army scout who'd been with the Mercer Ranch for 11 years, and whose approval or disapproval Colt seemed to weigh more heavily than any of the others. He found her at the barn, checking the condition of the animals they'd moved from the southern pasture. "You knew about that water before Wharton came out," he said. It wasn't a question. "I suspected," she said. "I wasn't certain." "You could have made more of a fuss about it." "I could have," she said. "It wouldn't have helped." Briggs leaned against the barn door with his arms crossed. He studied her the way a man studies terrain before he decides whether to cross it. "Harlan talked about your father," he said. Said Theodore Ashford was the most quietly useful man he'd ever known. Said he did more good in a room by saying 3 things than most men do saying 30. Evelyn stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "I didn't know Mr. Mercer had said that," she said. "He said a lot of things," Briggs said. "Not always to the people who needed to hear them." He pushed off the doorframe. "For what it's worth, the water thing. You were right." He walked back to the bunkhouse. Evelyn stood in the barn for a moment, her hand resting on the flank of a recovering animal, and let herself feel the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical work, but from spending every day in a place where you have to prove your right to exist before anyone will listen to what you're saying. She was very tired. She didn't show it to anyone. She went inside, ate dinner, and worked on the map until 10 o'clock. December brought 2 things: a hard freeze that came earlier than the almanac suggested, and a man named Stroud. Warren Stroud rode out to the ranch on a Thursday morning with a business card from a land company called Consolidated Western Holdings, and the smooth, patient manner of a man who'd made a career of arriving at the right moment. He was neither young nor old, with the kind of well-pressed appearance that looks out of place in ranch country and knows it and doesn't care. He asked for Colt, was shown to the main room, and sat across from Colt with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and began to talk about the future of frontier ranching. His argument was structured and reasonable sounding. Small independent ranches were failing across the territory. They didn't have the capital for the kind of improvements that modern grazing methods required. They couldn't negotiate decent cattle prices without volume, and they couldn't survive more than a season or two of bad conditions without bank intervention. Consolidated Western Holdings was offering a solution, a partnership arrangement where independent ranchers merged their operations under a larger management structure, retaining a share of the profits, while Consolidated provided capital, equipment, and market access. The offer on the table for Mercer Ranch was specific. Consolidated would absorb the ranch's bank debt, invest in improvements, and provide Colt with a 10-year management contract at a fixed salary and a 15% share of net profits. Evelyn sat in the kitchen doorway through most of this. She'd been in the kitchen when Stroud arrived, and she'd stayed there without being asked to leave or to join the conversation. It put her in a position that was neither in the room nor outside it, which was exactly where she wanted to be. She listened to Stroud's numbers. She listened to the way he described the 15% share as generous without comparing it to what the full operation was worth. She listened to the phrase management contract and the specific duration, 10 years. And the question he kept not quite answering, which was what happened to the land itself under the arrangement. When Colt walked Stroud to the door and shook his hand and said he'd think about it, Evelyn came fully into the main room. "Don't," she said. Colt turned. "Don't what?" "Don't think about that offer as though it's what it sounds like." Colt studied her expression. Something in it made him leave the door and come back to the table. "What do you mean?" She sat down and folded her hands on the table, a habit she had when she was about to be precise about something. He said partnership and management contract, but what he described is a sale. Once Consolidated absorbs the debt and the land is used as collateral for their investment, you're no longer the owner in any meaningful sense. You're an employee with a minority profit share on a 10-year term. At the end of 10 years, they renegotiate or they don't, and you have no land to fall back on. Colt was quiet. "The bank debt is real," she said, "and the offer to absorb it is real. But what they're buying with that debt is control of the property. That's the trade." "You know this how?" "My father's bookshop had a law section," she said, "and I've read about Consolidated Western Holdings before coming here. They operate this way across 4 territories. They've absorbed 16 ranches in the last 5 years. Not one original owner has retained meaningful operational control past the 3-year mark." Colt sat down. He stared at the table. His hands were flat on the wood, and she could see the tension in them. Not anger at her, she thought, but the particular tension of a man who'd been close to relief and had it taken away. "The bank review is in April," he said. "If we can't show improvement by then—" "I know," she said. "That's what he's counting on." "So what do we do?" It was the first time he'd said it that way. Not "what are you suggesting" or "what do you think?" "We." Evelyn noticed it and didn't remark on it. "We survive until spring," she said. "The North Spring restoration will hold, the contamination is cleared. If we can get the cattle through the winter without significant losses, the spring calving numbers should be enough to show the bank real improvement." "That's a lot of ifs." "Yes," she said. "It is." He got up again, restless, and stood at the window. Outside, the frozen ground was hard and pale, and the wind was pushing from the northwest in the way it did when another front was building. "There's something else," he said, without turning around. She waited. "The rotational grazing thing you mentioned, the plan you had for cycling the north and east sections." He paused. "How long before we'd see results?" Evelyn had proposed this 6 weeks ago. Colt had listened and done nothing with it. "First rotation, 2 to 3 months," she said carefully. "Measurable grass recovery in the north section by early spring if we start the cycling now." He was still at the window. "Walk me through it." She got the map. January hit the Mercer Ranch like something personal. The temperature dropped hard in the first week and didn't recover. The creek on the eastern boundary froze solid. 2 of the horses developed the kind of joint stiffness that needed daily attention. Feed costs ran higher than projected because the cattle needed more to maintain condition in the cold, and the middle pasture, already strained from carrying the relocated southern herd, was showing serious degradation. Colt rode fence every day in the bitter cold. He came in at dark with ice in his beard and the kind of silence that wasn't quiet but full. Evelyn would have food ready. They'd eat. He'd review whatever numbers she'd been working on during the day and ask questions that had gotten, over the weeks, gradually less guarded. It wasn't warmth what was developing between them. It was something more durable and less comfortable than warmth. A working relationship between two people who'd stopped pretending the other was going to disappear. There were still frictions. Colt told Briggs to hold off on the rotational grazing shift because he wanted to see how the middle pasture settled before moving the herd again. Evelyn thought this was wrong. The middle pasture wasn't going to settle on its own, and every week they waited was more degradation. But she'd learned when to push and when to let a decision play out. She let it go and documented her reasoning in her notebook. 3 weeks later, Colt told her to start the rotation. "You were going to do it eventually," she said, not unkindly. "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Of the plan or of me?" He didn't answer that. But the question didn't make him leave the room, which was its own kind of answer. The Cowboys had their own adjustments to make. Pete had come around fairly early. He was a practical man who cared more about whether something worked than whose idea it was. Briggs was neutral in the way that a very experienced person is neutral. He watched and assessed and kept his own counsel. Cal, Pete's brother, followed Pete's lead without much analysis. Archie was the problem. He'd been manageable through the channel work and the herd movement and the rotation planning, but something about the January cold and the accumulated indignity of taking direction from Evelyn had settled in him like a splinter working its way deeper. He started with small things, doing tasks differently than she'd asked, then claiming he'd misunderstood, leaving work half-finished in sections she was supposed to check, making observations to the other hands that she was technically out of earshot for, but not actually out of earshot for. "She's going to run this operation into the ground before spring," she heard him tell Cal one evening. "Colt's too proud to admit he's let a city woman take over his grandfather's ranch." Cal said nothing audible in response. Evelyn went back inside and sat at the kitchen table for a while, not working, just sitting. It was the kind of moment where the weight of everything, the cold, the debt, the daily effort of being the one person in every room who had to prove herself twice for every once, settled on her all at once. She thought about her father, about what he'd said on the stairs. She got up and made coffee and went back to work on the spring calving projections. 2 days later, she told Colt about Archie. Not in a way that asked him to do anything in particular. She described what she'd observed, what she'd heard, and what effect she thought it was having on the crew's cooperation with the grazing rotation. Colt listened without expression. Then he went out to the bunkhouse. She didn't hear what was said. Archie was quieter for the next week. Not agreeable. She wasn't expecting agreeable, but quieter. Whatever Colt had said had been sufficient to pull him back to the edge of manageable. She thanked Colt for it at breakfast the next morning. He said, "Don't thank me. He's one more problem I don't need." "I know," she said. "Still." He looked at her for a moment across the table. It was a brief look, the kind that happens between people when one of them almost says something and then doesn't. He stood up and put his hat on and went out to start the day. The letter from the bank arrived in the 3rd week of January, and it was worse than either of them had expected. They'd been tracking the loan terms carefully, and the April review date had been fixed in both their minds as the deadline to show improvement. What the letter explained, in the dense, cautious language of institutional finance, was that a change in the bank's management structure had moved the review up. The new review date was the 1st of March, 6 weeks earlier than they'd planned for. Colt read the letter twice at the kitchen table. His face didn't change much, but the stillness that came over him was the specific stillness of a man doing rapid internal arithmetic and not liking the results. Evelyn read it after him. She set it down on the table between them. "The calving numbers won't be there by March," he said. "Spring calving doesn't start until mid-February at the earliest. We'll have a few weeks of data at best." "We have the water remediation," she said. "That's documented." "That's not enough to show. The grazing rotation is documented," she said. "The herd health improvement is documented. The cattle we pulled from the southern pasture are all recovered and gaining condition. I have records of all of it." "Evelyn." He said her name like a word he'd been practicing. "A few sick cows that got better, and a rotation plan that 6 weeks in are not going to convince Henry Pruitt at the bank that this ranch is worth carrying another year." Not on their own, she agreed. But there's something else. She got up and took a folder from the shelf above the desk. A thick folder she'd assembled over the past month, which he'd seen her working on but hadn't examined. She set it in front of him. I've been in correspondence with a rancher east of here named Garrison, who's been running longhorn crosses for 3 years, she said. His calving rates are 30% higher than the territory average, and his animals come in at better weight. He's willing to lease us 2 premium bulls for the spring breeding season at a rate we can afford. If we document that breeding contract, and I can present the bank with a projection based on Garrison's documented outcomes, it changes the story we're telling them. Colt opened the folder. He read through the letters, her correspondence with Garrison, the preliminary breeding agreement, the outcome data she'd compiled from Garrison's own records and cross-referenced with regional cattle surveys. He read for a long time. You've been working on this since November, he said. Since October, she said. I wrote Garrison the week after I arrived. He looked up at her. Before I knew about the bank letter, she said, before the water problem, I was looking at the cattle breed from the start. The stock your grandfather was running isn't well suited to this land in drought conditions. It was the right breed for a different era. Colt closed the folder. He put his hands on it the way a man puts his hands on something he's not sure he has the right to. You've been planning this the whole time, he said. I've been trying to save the ranch, she said. The same as you. The kitchen was very quiet. Wind moved against the windows, the kind of persistent January wind that tested everything, seams, frames, the patience of people sitting inside it. I owe you an apology, Colt said. Evelyn looked at him. He stopped, tried again. I haven't made this easy. I know that. No, she agreed. You haven't. I didn't know what you were, what you're capable of. He said it without deflection, which took more honesty than most men managed. I thought my grandfather had done me a disservice. I thought he'd lost his judgment at the end. And now? He looked at the folder under his hands. He looked at her. I think he saw something I didn't, he said, and I think I've wasted 2 months I didn't have. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She'd thought about what she'd say if he ever got to this point. She'd thought about it more than she'd admit. And what she'd planned to say was something measured and forward-looking. What came out instead was simpler and more honest. We haven't wasted it, she said. We've been learning what the other person is. That takes as long as it takes. He held her gaze for a beat longer than he usually did. Then he looked down at the folder again. What do we need to do to be ready for the bank by March 1st? He asked. She pulled her chair closer to the table. Here's where we start, she said, and she opened the folder between them. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Mercer Ranch, they sat on the same side of a problem. Outside, the January wind pushed hard against the house and found, as it always does, that what's built solidly enough will hold. The meeting with Henry Pruitt at the Caldwell Flats Savings and Loan took place on the morning of March 2nd, one day after the revised deadline, because a late winter storm had closed the road into town the day before, and Pruitt himself had sent word that he'd allow a single day's grace. Colt and Evelyn rode in together on the wagon. The storm had left the road rutted and half-frozen, and neither of them spoke much during the 2-hour drive. Evelyn had the documentation folder in a leather satchel on her lap. She'd spent the last week reorganizing it, adding the February calving numbers, partial but promising, and a formal letter from Garrison confirming the breeding contract and attesting to the performance outcomes of his Longhorn Cross program. She'd written a 12-page summary of the ranch's improvement plan herself, in the clear, structured prose of someone who'd read enough technical documents to know what they needed to sound like. Colt had read it the night before. He hadn't suggested changes. He'd put it back in the folder and said, "It's good," in the voice of a man who meant it and wasn't entirely comfortable with how much he meant it. Pruitt was a careful, compact man in his 50s who wore a good suit and kept his office in precise order and had a gift for making people feel the full weight of their debt without raising his voice. He'd known Harlan Mercer for 30 years, and he'd agreed to the ranch's current loan terms out of that history, not out of confidence in Colt's management. He made this clear, diplomatically, but unmistakably, in the first 5 minutes of the meeting. Then Evelyn set the folder on his desk and opened it. She walked Pruitt through the documentation in the order she'd arranged it, the contamination problem and its resolution first, because it was concrete and visible and showed cause and effect clearly. then the water system improvements and the cost-benefit of the work against projected losses, then the rotational grazing program with its 6-week results and projected outcomes, then the breeding contract and Garrison's performance data. She spoke in a measured, even tone, answering his questions directly and without elaboration when the answer was simple. Prewitt listened. He asked more questions of Evelyn than of Colt, and he asked good ones, the kind that meant he was testing the analysis, not just the presentation. She held up under all of them. When she finished, Prewitt sat back in his chair and looked at the documentation for a long moment. "This is thorough," he said. "The ranch has a viable path," Evelyn said. "What it needed was the right approach to the land, not capital infusion from outside." Prewitt looked at Colt. "Your wife put this together." "She did," Colt said. There was no hesitation in it and no qualification. Prewitt looked back at Evelyn. Something in his expression had shifted, not warmly, but with the specific adjustment of a man recalibrating an assumption. "I'll extend the review period to September," he said. "You'll need to show me calving outcomes and summer grazing results by August 15th. If the numbers support this projection, I'll restructure the loan terms." It wasn't victory. It was 6 more months of margin on a razor's edge. But it was enough. Outside on the street, in the cold March air, Colt stood beside the wagon for a moment before helping Evelyn up. "You saved us in there," he said. "We saved it," she said. "You built something worth saving. I just showed him the map." He gave her a look that wasn't quite a smile, something tighter and more complicated than a smile, the expression of a man beginning to understand that he'd underestimated someone badly and wasn't sure yet how to carry that knowledge. They drove home. The road was still rough. The wind was still cold. The ranch was still in debt, and the summer was still months away, and nothing was settled. But something between them had shifted into a new position, and this time it held. Spring came to the Mercer Ranch, the way spring comes to hard country. Not as relief, but as pressure. The ground thawed and the grass came up thin but present in the north section, exactly as Evelyn had projected, and the first rotational shift showed what the land could do when it was given time to recover. Colt rode the north section on a morning in late March and came back and told Briggs to look at it. Briggs went and looked and came back with nothing to say, which was how Briggs expressed being impressed. The calving season ran through February and into March, and the numbers were better than they dared to project, not because of the longhorn breeding, which wouldn't show results until the following season, but because the animals that had been on clean water and adequate rotation all winter were in better condition going into calving than any of them had expected. More animals in good condition meant better birth outcomes and stronger calves. Evelyn recorded every number in her ledger and updated the projection documents she'd left with Prewitt. The Garrison bulls arrived in the first week of April. They were big, rangy animals with the kind of deep chest and strong hindquarters that spoke to the breeding program Garrison had described in his letters. And the Mercer cattle hand stood at the fence watching them unload with expressions that ranged from skeptical to openly doubtful. Archie said they looked like something a city person would order out of a catalog. Evelyn, who was standing at the fence when he said it, said, "Good. The buyers in Abilene like catalog cattle. They pay better for them." Archie opened his mouth and closed it again. Pete caught Evelyn's eye from across the fence and looked down at the ground to hide that he was almost smiling. The integration of the bulls into the breeding program was Evelyn's project, planned and executed over 3 weeks with the careful documentation of a scientist running a controlled trial, which, in a practical sense, was exactly what she was doing. She recorded which animals were bred when, noted the condition of each, and set up a tracking system that Colt could continue through the season without needing to hold every detail in his head. It was during this period that Colt started doing something he hadn't done before. He began asking her opinion before making operational decisions, not after. Small things at first, which section to move the herd to, when to pull a particular animal from the breeding rotation. Then larger ones. The ranch was changing, slowly and without announcement, into something different from what it had been under Harlan's management, and the change was in the way decisions were made as much as in the decisions themselves. The cowboys felt it. Some of them were fine with it, some of them weren't. The sabotage started in May, and for 3 days nobody knew it was sabotage. The first sign was the east fence line. A 300-yard section that had been in good repair came down overnight, and 40 head of cattle drifted into the neighboring territory before anyone noticed at first light. It took most of a day to locate and return them, and 2 animals were lost in the creek crossing during the recovery. Colt and Briggs rode the downed fence line, and Colt said it had been a poor patch job on an old section that had given way under the spring pressure. That was plausible. Old fence failed. He ordered the section rebuilt, and that was that. The second sign was the water tank on the north section. The new pump feed, the one Evelyn had designed, stopped running in the first week of May, and when Colt and Deke went to look at it, they found the intake valve had been packed with clay and debris. Colt said it was sediment buildup. The creek ran high in spring and carried debris. He had Deke clear it. Evelyn said nothing at the time, but she wrote both incidents in her notebook, dated, with a note that she was not yet certain they were connected. The third sign removed the uncertainty. On the morning of May 12th, Evelyn walked out to the breeding pen before breakfast to check on an animal she'd flagged the previous evening as potentially in early distress. What she found was the gate to the bullpen open and both garrison bulls gone. The ground around the gate showed boot tracks. Multiple sets, not from any of the ranch hands. The sole patterns were wrong, and the latch had been lifted, not broken. Animals don't lift latches. She stood in the mud of the pen for a full minute, just reading the ground. Then she went and got Colt. He came out in his shirt sleeves with his coffee still in his hand and looked at the open gate and the tracks, and his face went through several things in quick succession before settling into the particular expression of a man who has just understood that someone has decided to hurt him deliberately. "How long have they been gone?" he said. "I don't know. I found it 20 minutes ago." "Which direction?" She pointed south where the tracks led. He handed her his coffee, a small automatic gesture that neither of them remarked on, and went to the barn to saddle up. They found the bulls 6 miles south, on land that bordered a large grazing operation called the Callaway outfit. The animals had been driven. The hoof pattern was too deliberate and the direction too straight for a natural drift, and they were standing in a gully on the Callaway side of an unmarked boundary line, penned loosely by a temporary rope fence that had been set up and then left. Colt stared at the rope fence. Then he looked at the Callaway land stretching north beyond it. "They drove them here," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said, "so that it looked like the bulls had wandered onto Callaway land. And so that Callaway could claim the animals as strays," she said, "and dispute ownership. It would take months to resolve legally, and in the meantime the breeding season would be over." Colt turned in the saddle and looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "Since the fence came down in March," she said. "I wasn't sure. Now I am." "You think Callaway's behind all of it?" "I think someone with access to this land and a reason to want us to fail is behind it," she said carefully. "I don't know yet whether it's Callaway personally or someone working on his behalf, but the pattern is deliberate. The fence, the pump intake, now this. These aren't accidents." They retrieved the bulls, which Callaway's foreman, a stone-faced man named Tully, did not contest, though he watched them go with an expression that contained its own kind of message, and rode back to the ranch in the kind of silence that was actually very loud. That night, Evelyn wrote 5 pages of notes documenting every incident she could now identify as potentially connected, including 2 she hadn't listed separately before, a missing section of repair lumber that had been left by the north barn, and a gate that she'd found incorrectly latched in a way that could have resulted in a herd mixing if she hadn't caught it. She dated everything. She described everything. She drew a timeline. When she was done, she put it in a new folder separate from the bank documentation. She wrote on the front of it in her clear hand, "Evidence of deliberate interference." She told Colt about the folder in the morning. "You've been documenting it," he said. "Since May," she said. "Since the fence." I hoped I was wrong. He took the folder and read through it at the kitchen table while she made breakfast. He read it the way he'd learned to read everything she put in front of him, completely, without rushing, with the expression of a man taking inventory. When he put it down, he said, "We should go see the sheriff." "We should," Evelyn agreed. "And we should also talk to the Hendersons and the Trask family before we do." The Henderson Ranch and the Trask operation were the 2 closest independent ranches to the Mercer property. Both had been struggling. The Hendersons had had their fence line cut twice in the fall, which Bud Henderson had written off as vandals. Bud Henderson was a large, weather-beaten man who'd been ranching his family's land for 30 years and who had the stubborn patience of someone who'd survived enough bad seasons to distrust easy explanations, but also distrust complicated ones. He listened to Evelyn lay out the pattern of incidents at the Mercer Ranch with his arms crossed and his jaw working, and when she finished, he looked at his wife Nora across the kitchen table. Nora Henderson said, "Show them the wire, Bud." Bud got up without a word and came back with a short section of fence wire. He set it on the table. Evelyn examined it. The cut was clean, not worn through or stressed to breaking, but cut deliberately with a good tool. "I kept it because it didn't look right," Bud said. "Didn't know what to do with it." "May I?" Evelyn asked. Bud nodded. She put it in her satchel. They rode from the Henderson place to the Trask Ranch, and the story there was similar in kind if different in detail. Martha Trask was a widow who'd been running the ranch since her husband died 2 years prior, with the help of her 2 grown sons. She had a sharper sense of what had been happening than Bud Henderson. She'd noticed that the water diversion that failed in March had failed in a way that didn't match the thaw. The break was too clean, and it was in the wrong place for natural pressure. But she hadn't wanted to make an accusation she couldn't prove. "Who do you think it is?" Martha asked. "I have suspicions," Evelyn said. "But suspicions aren't what we need." "What do we need?" "Everything you can document," Evelyn said. "Dates, descriptions, anything physical you've kept, and your willingness to go to the sheriff together." Martha looked at her 2 sons, then back at Evelyn. "My husband used to say the problem with this territory is everyone waits for someone else to go first," she said. "We'll go." The meeting with Sheriff Amos Delaney took place on a Thursday afternoon in his office, which smelled of old coffee and wood smoke, and the particular staleness of a small institutional space where important things occasionally happen amid a lot of waiting. Delaney was a deliberate man who'd been sheriff of Caldwell Flats for 12 years, and who had learned that the gap between what people told him and what had actually happened was sometimes very large. He listened to all 3 parties, Colt and Evelyn for the Mercer Ranch, Bud Henderson for his place, Martha Trask for hers, without much visible reaction. Then he looked at Evelyn's documentation folder. He read through it slowly. He looked at the wire section Bud had kept. He listened to Martha's description of the diversion break and asked her 2 specific questions about the location and the condition of the breakpoint. "You believe this is Callaway," he said when he'd finished. "I believe the pattern suggests someone with knowledge of all 3 properties and a reason to want the independent ranches in this area to fail," Evelyn said. "Callaway has offered to buy out both the Henderson and Trask operations in the last year at prices that only make sense if he believed they were going to fail soon. He made a similar offer to us through an intermediary named Warren Stroud in December." Delaney looked at her. "I know Stroud." "I thought you might," she said. Something shifted in Delaney's expression. A small recalibration, the look of a man connecting things he'd kept separate. "I can't move on Callaway without more than a pattern," he said. "You know that." "I know that," Evelyn said. "What I need from you is a record that this complaint was made, dated today, and that 3 operations have reported deliberate interference with their properties. That record establishes the timeline, if anything else happens." Delaney studied her. "You're planning for what comes next." "I'm always planning for what comes next," she said. He made the record. He was careful and thorough about it, which told her he took it more seriously than his careful, neutral expression suggested. When they left his office, Martha Trask caught Evelyn's arm on the steps. "Where did you come from?" Martha said, half to herself. "St. Louis," Evelyn said, "by way of a failing ranch that needed help." Martha shook her head slowly. "You come find me if you need anything." June arrived, and with it the dry heat that was the summer norm in that territory, and the North Spring, Evelyn's first project, the one that had started everything, was running steady and clear. She'd had it tested after the sabotage incidents, concerned about tampering, and it came back clean. The rotational grazing program had brought the north and east sections back to a carrying capacity neither Colt nor Briggs had thought possible in under a year. The ranch was not recovered. That would take longer. But it was demonstrably moving in the right direction, and the documented evidence of that movement was being carefully maintained in a series of folders that Evelyn kept in a locked case under her desk. The crew had changed too, in the way that working groups change when circumstances force sustained cooperation. Briggs had shifted from neutral to quietly supportive. He never said so directly, but he'd started coming to Evelyn with operational questions rather than taking them all to Colt, which was a form of acknowledgement more meaningful than any compliment. Pete and Cal were straightforward by now. Deke had been reliable from the start. Archie was still Archie. But even he had pulled back from active resistance into something closer to grudging competence. Whether that was Colt's conversation with him in January, or the accumulating evidence that Evelyn's methods worked, or just the grinding effect of months of shared hard labor, she didn't know and she didn't much care. He did his work. That was enough. Then July brought the stampede. It happened on a Tuesday night, after a week of unusually intense heat that had kept the cattle restless and the hands short-tempered. Evelyn woke to the sound before she knew what it was, a low building thunder that her body understood before her mind did, and she was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake. The herd was moving. The middle pasture herd, 340 head, was running south in the dark. She was dressed and out the door in 3 minutes. Colt was already at the barn, shouting to Briggs and Pete and whoever else was upright. The night was hot and moonlit enough to see, which was the only mercy, and the cattle were running hard in a direction that would take them through the south fence and into broken gully country where you could lose animals for days. It took 2 hours to turn them. 2 hours of hard riding in the dark on ground you couldn't fully see, with animals running on blind instinct and the constant risk that a horse would hit a hole or a rider would misjudge a cut and go down under the herd. Evelyn rode the east flank with Pete, working the edge of the movement, pushing animals back toward the center. She wasn't a skilled enough rider for this kind of work. She knew that. But she was present, and she could hold a flank position, and she wasn't going to stay at the house while the summer's work potentially ran itself to death in a gully. When it was over, they'd lost 11 animals. 8 confirmed dead in the gully, 3 still missing, and the south fence had a 100-yard section down. Colt came back to the yard covered in dust and breathing hard, and looked at Briggs with an expression that asked the question without words. Briggs said, "East fence line. Someone popped the rails on a 40-foot section and ran a horse along the perimeter. I found the marks." Colt turned away. His hands were fists at his sides, and for a moment he stood with his back to all of them, very still, doing something private with his fury. Then he turned back. "What do we have left?" he asked Evelyn. 329 head if the 3 missing don't turn up, she said. Summer calves still in the north section. They weren't touched. The breeding bulls are secure, I checked. Garrison's bulls. Secure, she said. I padlocked the pen 2 weeks ago when I started worrying about another attempt. He looked at her. She'd done that without telling him, taken the precaution, spent the money for the lock without asking or announcing it. His expression did something complicated. How bad is this for August? He asked. She knew he meant the bank. 11 head is a setback, she said. It's not fatal to the projection. If we document the tampering and report it to Delaney tonight, it becomes part of the pattern of deliberate interference. That matters for the bank meeting, too. It establishes that our losses have an external cause, not a management failure. Tonight, he said. We ride to Delaney tonight? I'll have the documentation ready in an hour, she said. He looked at his crew, exhausted, dirty, the adrenaline of the ride draining out of all of them into the flat aftermath of a bad night. He looked at Evelyn. Get the documentation, he said. Briggs, Pete, ride with me. Delaney was not pleased to be woken at 2 in the morning, but he was a professional and he looked at what Evelyn put in front of him and he wrote down what he was told with the focused attention of a man who has now seen enough of a pattern to know where it's going. This is the 3rd physical incident in 2 months, he said. 4th, Evelyn said. The pump intake in May, the bullpen gate in May, the wire cut 2 weeks ago on the south section, and now this, the wire cut 2 weeks ago. You didn't report that. I documented it, and I'm reporting it now, she said. I wanted to come with a complete picture, not incident by incident. Delaney looked at the documentation. He looked at Colt. He said, I'm going to ride out to the Callaway operation tomorrow, not to make an accusation, to have a conversation. That's your judgment, Evelyn said. What I need documented tonight is the timeline, the losses, and the physical evidence of the fence tampering, which Briggs will describe to you. Briggs described it. Delaney wrote it down. He told them he'd have a deputy ride the Mercer South fence line, E8 at first light to make an independent observation. They rode back to the ranch in the last hours of the night. Nobody talked. The horses were tired and the riders were tired, and the sky was beginning to pale at the eastern edge by the time they got back. In the yard, before everyone dispersed to whatever sleep was left, Colt stopped beside Evelyn. "You padlocked that pen 2 weeks ago," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "I didn't want to alarm you over a precaution that might not have been necessary," she said. "If nothing happened, there was no need for the conversation. If something happened, I wanted to have prevented it." He was quiet for a moment, for the sky was lightening. "You think 3 moves ahead," he said. "I try to," she said. "It doesn't always work." "It worked tonight," he said. "Those bulls are worth more than the 11 animals we lost. If they'd taken those bulls—" He stopped. "They didn't," she said. He nodded, looked at the barn, looked back at her. "Get some sleep," he said. "We've got a long summer left." She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a few minutes before going to bed, not because she wasn't tired. She was exhausted in every part of herself, but because she needed a moment to simply sit and not be doing anything or managing anything or thinking 3 moves ahead. 11 animals dead in the dark. A summer still to get through. A bank meeting in August that everything depended on. An enemy who hadn't shown his face yet, but whose hands were all over everything that went wrong. She was afraid. She'd been afraid since January, in the particular quiet way that practical people are afraid, not paralyzed by it, but aware of it, carrying it alongside everything else without letting it determine any decision. She thought about what her father would say. She thought he'd tell her she was doing it right. She thought he'd also tell her she didn't have to do it alone, and that accepting help wasn't weakness, it was just sense. She thought about Colt in the yard, saying you think 3 moves ahead. She went to bed. She was asleep before she'd finished the thought. Outside, the eastern sky came fully light, indifferent to what had happened in the dark, offering the day without judgment or comfort, the way the frontier always did. Take it or leave it, but either way it's here. Delaney's visit to the Callaway operation produced nothing immediately useful, which surprised no one who had been paying attention. Royal Callaway received the sheriff on his front porch with the hospitality of a man who has nothing to hide because he has been careful enough to hide it properly. He was 61 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that suggested he'd once done physical work, and hadn't forgotten how, with the slow, deliberate speech of someone who understood that silence and patience were more useful than most weapons. He told Delaney he was sorry to hear about the troubles at the neighboring ranches. He said the territory was full of drifters and opportunists, and it was a shame that hardworking families had to suffer for it. He offered coffee. He answered every question without answering any of them. Delaney rode back to Caldwell Flats with nothing he could act on and told Colt so directly. "He's careful," Delaney said. "Whatever he's doing, he's not doing it himself, and he's not doing it close to home." "Tully," Colt said. Callaway's foreman, the stone-faced man who'd watched them retrieve the garrison bulls from the gully without a word, had been on the Callaway payroll for 7 years and was known in the territory as the kind of man who executed instructions without requiring them to be repeated or explained. "Tully's got 3 men who ride for him exclusive," Delaney said. "Not the regular Callaway hands. 3 men who came up from the south about 18 months ago and who nobody knows much about." 18 months ago, Evelyn said. She was at the kitchen table with her documentation folder open. "That's consistent with the timing of the Henderson fence incidents and the first Trask water problem." Delaney looked at her. By this point, he'd stopped being surprised by the precision of her recall. "It's consistent," he agreed, "but consistent isn't evidence." "I know," she said. "What would be evidence?" Delaney thought about it. "Catching one of those men in the act, or finding something that connects them directly to what happened on your property. Physical evidence at the scene of one of the incidents with a traceable connection to Callaway's operation." "The wire," Evelyn said. She opened the folder and removed the section of fence wire Bud Henderson had kept, now in a cloth wrap with her documentation. This was cut with a specific tool, a fence cutter with a particular blade profile. "I can see it in the cut pattern. If you found that tool, I'd need grounds to search the Callaway property," Delaney said, "and I don't have them." Evelyn closed the folder. She didn't argue the point. She filed it in the same place she filed everything that wasn't resolved yet. The part of her mind that kept running even when she wasn't actively working on a problem. The part that her father had called her underground river, always moving, even when the surface was still. After Delaney left, Colt sat at the table across from her. He's not going to be able to move on Calloway without something more, Colt said. No, she agreed. So we need to get him something more. Yes. He looked at her. Do you have an idea? I have the beginning of one, she said. Give me a few days. He gave her the few days without asking for more. This, too, was something that had changed between them. He'd learned that when Evelyn said she needed time to think, the thinking was worth waiting for. The idea came together over 4 days, and when Evelyn brought it to Colt, it wasn't a single plan, but a set of interlocking pieces that needed to be assembled in sequence. The first piece was the south fence line. The section that had been cut during the stampede had been repaired, but Evelyn proposed leaving a short section of the eastern boundary in a state of visible disrepair. Not actually weak, but appearing weak, with rails that looked loose and posts that looked like they were failing. It was the kind of thing that someone watching the property from a distance might identify as an opportunity. The second piece was Briggs. She'd talked to Briggs separately before bringing the plan to Colt, which was the one part of it she felt slightly uncomfortable about in retrospect. But she'd needed to know whether Briggs would do what she was going to ask before she committed Colt to the plan, because if Briggs refused, it fell apart. Briggs hadn't refused. He'd listened to what she was asking, which was for him to spend 3 nights watching the eastern boundary from a concealed position with enough patience to wait out whoever might come. And he'd said, 3 nights is nothing. I've waited longer than that for elk. She'd believed him. He had the particular stillness of someone for whom extended patience wasn't an effort, but a natural condition. The third piece was documentation, which was always her piece. She wrote out what she expected to happen, the dates, the method, the evidence she hoped to collect, and she put a copy of it in a sealed envelope that she gave to Delaney with a request that he open it only if an incident occurred. This was deliberate. She wanted to demonstrate that the outcome had been anticipated, not constructed after the fact. When she laid it out for Colt, he sat through the whole explanation without interrupting, which she'd learned meant he was taking it seriously. When she finished, he said, "You talked to Briggs before you brought this to me." "I needed to know if it was feasible before I proposed it," she said. I was quiet for a moment. It was a moment she watched carefully, because there was something genuinely reasonable in his hesitation. She had, in a real sense, gone around him, even if the reasoning was practical. "Next time, come to me first," he said. "You're right," she said. "I should have." He held her gaze for a second. Then he said, "Tell me what you need from me for this to work." Briggs spent the first night on the eastern boundary without incident. He came back at dawn, made coffee, reported nothing, and slept for 4 hours before going back to regular work. He did this without complaint and without drama, which was how Briggs did everything. The second night was the same. The third night, in the hour before midnight, 3 riders came along the eastern boundary from the south. Briggs had positioned himself in a dry wash 20 yards back from the fence line, downwind and low, with a clear sight line to the section of fence Evelyn had staged as vulnerable. He watched the 3 men work with the economy of people who'd done this before. No wasted motion, no talking, specific division of labor. 2 of them went to work on the fence rails, while the third held the horses and watched the dark to the north. Briggs was close enough to see their faces in the moonlight. He recognized one of them, not by name, but from having seen him at a distance on the Calloway land during a boundary ride earlier in the spring. He let them finish what they were doing. He noted what they did and how long it took and what tools they used. Then he rode hard to the ranch and woke Colt at midnight. Colt woke Evelyn. She was dressed in 4 minutes with her documentation folder in hand, and they rode together to Delaney's house in town, arriving at 2 in the morning for the second time that summer. Delaney opened the sealed envelope. He read what Evelyn had written. He looked at Briggs. "You can identify one of the men," he said. "I can put him on the Calloway property in April," Briggs said, "and I can describe all 3 of them well enough." "That's enough for me to bring them in for questioning," Delaney said. I was fully awake now, with the focused energy of a man who has been patient for a long time and has finally been handed what he needed. "And if one of them talks, they'll talk about Tully," Colt said. "And Tully will talk about Calloway," Evelyn said. "If you move on them quickly enough before Calloway knows what happened, before anyone has time to arrange a story." Delaney was already reaching for his boots. What followed happened faster than any of them had dared to expect, and in some ways faster than the legal system in a frontier territory was supposed to work. which said something about what Delaney had been waiting for and how ready he'd been to move the moment he had grounds. He brought the three men in before dawn. By noon the following day, the youngest of them, a man barely out of his 20s who'd been told this was fence work and land pressure, nothing serious, the kind of thing everybody did on the frontier, she had described 6 months of assignments given by Tully, including the bullpen incident, the pump intake, and the night of the stampede. Tully was brought in that afternoon. He was not cooperative in the way that the young man had been cooperative. He was the closed, deliberate kind of uncooperative that spoke to long practice. But the young man's account was specific enough and matched Evelyn's documentation closely enough that Delaney had what he needed to go to the county land authority with a formal complaint against Consolidated Western Holdings and its affiliated operations in the territory. Because that was what came out of it in the end. Not just Callaway. Callaway was a piece of something larger, a coordinated acquisition program that Consolidated Western Holdings had been running across 4 territories, using a combination of above-board buyout offers and below-the-table pressure to force independent ranches into a distressed position before swooping in with a take-it-or-leave-it purchase. Warren Stroud, who'd sat in Colt's main room in December with his untouched coffee and his talk about the future of frontier ranching, was the regional coordinator for all of it. Evelyn read the county authorities' preliminary findings in Delaney's office 3 weeks after the arrest of the 3 fencemen, and she sat with the document for a long time before she looked up. "They were doing this to all of us from the start," she said. "From before the start," Delaney said. "The water contamination on your south section, our investigator thinks that wasn't the tanning operation. Or not only the tanning operation, there's evidence someone redirected drainage from an old waste site onto your property deliberately, about 2 years ago, before your husband inherited." Colt, who was standing by the window, said nothing for a moment. "Before Harlan died," he said. "Around that time," Delaney said carefully. Evelyn looked at Colt. He had his back to the room and she could see the tension in his shoulders. Not the anger tension, which she knew by now, but something more complicated. The tension of a man reassembling his understanding of the past 18 months of his life. Harlan hadn't just left him a bride and a failing ranch. He'd left him a ranch that was being deliberately destroyed, and a woman who happened to have the specific knowledge and the specific disposition to identify and fight what was happening to it. She didn't say this out loud. It wasn't the moment for it. "What happens to Callaway's land?" Colt asked. "That's going to take some time to work through," Delaney said. "There are legal proceedings, claims, counterclaims. But several of the grazing territories Callaway's been operating on in the past 2 years, there are questions about how he acquired them." "The boundary surveys," Evelyn said. Delaney looked at her. "You know about those." "I suspected," she said. "The territory line between Callaway's north section and the Mercer east section never matched the original survey documents. I've been looking at the county records. The boundary was redrawn 12 years ago by a surveyor named Pickett, who did a significant amount of work for Consolidated Western Holdings affiliates around the same period." Delaney set down his pen. "Where did you find that?" "County Record Office in Harmon," she said. "I wrote to them in February. The response came last month." She opened the folder and passed him 4 pages of copied survey records. "The original boundary gives the Mercer Ranch access to a section of the high grazing territory on the north ridge that the current survey puts inside the Callaway line. About 300 acres. The room was quiet. Colt turned from the window. He looked at the survey documents in Delaney's hands. He looked at Evelyn. "You've had this since last month," he said. "Since I verified it against the original survey 3 weeks ago," she said. "I wanted to be certain before I said anything." 300 acres of high grazing on the North Ridge," Colt said slowly. "That's summer range. That's what the Mercer Ranch needs to support a significantly larger herd," she said. "If the boundary is restored to the original survey." Delaney looked at both of them. "This is going to be a legal process. It won't happen overnight." "I know," Evelyn said, "but it's documented. It's in the county record. It happened." She paused. "That's where everything starts, with a document that says what is true." The bank meeting on August 15th was not the meeting either of them had prepared for in January. In January, they'd been preparing to argue for survival, to show Henry Pruitt enough improvement to justify carrying the loan another year. What they walked into on a hot August morning was something different, and they both felt it in the changed quality of the waiting room, in the way Prewitt's assistant looked at them when they came in the fact that Prewitt himself came out to greet them rather than having them shown in. The summer cattle numbers were better than any projection Evelyn had made. The Longhorn Cross calves, the first generation of the Garrison breeding program, had come in stronger and heavier than anticipated, and the buyers who'd come through the territory in late July had noticed. 3 separate purchasing agents had made inquiries about the Mercer herd by name. One of them had made a preliminary offer before the summer market even opened. In addition to the cattle numbers, Evelyn had brought the documentation on the legal proceedings against Consolidated Western Holdings and the county authorities' preliminary finding that the Mercer Ranch had been the target of deliberate interference. This changed the narrative of the difficult winter and the livestock losses from management failure to external sabotage, a significant distinction when a bank was assessing risk. And she'd brought the survey documents. Prewitt looked at those last. He read them carefully, the way he'd read the improvement plan documentation in March, and his expression did the same careful recalibration. If the boundary is restored to the original survey, he said, the Mercer Ranch's assessed land value increases substantially. Enough to retire the current loan balance with a reasonable margin, Evelyn said, and to secure a restructured credit line at more favorable terms if expansion financing is needed. Prewitt looked at Colt. Your wife has been managing your books. My wife has been managing most of it, Colt said. I've been learning to stay out of her way when she's right and catch her when she's wrong. Prewitt's expression shifted very slightly towards something that wasn't quite amusement but lived in the same neighborhood. Has she been wrong? He asked. Colt considered this with the genuine seriousness the question deserved. Once. She thought we could hold off rebuilding the south barn through the winter. She was wrong about that. Cost us 2 weeks of work in bad weather we could have avoided. Prewitt looked at Evelyn. He's right, she said. I underestimated the barn. Prewitt closed the folder. He straightened it on his desk. He said, I'm going to recommend to the board a full loan restructure on terms favorable to the current operational direction of the ranch. I'll need the legal proceedings to resolve on the boundary question before we can formalize the land assessment, but the cattle outcomes and the documented improvement plan are sufficient for restructuring purposes. He extended his hand to Colt, then to Evelyn. Mrs. Mercer, he said, whatever your grandfather-in-law thought he was doing when he arranged this, he seems to have known something. He knew my father, Evelyn said. I think that was enough for him. What? The autumn that followed was not simple. Nothing about the legal proceedings was simple, and nothing about rebuilding a ranch's reputation in a territory where it had nearly failed was simple. But there was a quality to the work that hadn't been there before, a momentum that even the remaining complications couldn't fully interrupt. The boundary case moved through the county authority with the deliberate patience of all legal processes, but it moved. Consolidated Western Holdings' coordinated acquisition scheme across 4 territories had attracted the attention of Federal Land Authority investigators, and that attention accelerated what might otherwise have taken years. Warren Stroud settled a civil claim without admitting to anything specific, which was how men like Stroud settled claims. Tully, facing criminal charges, provided a detailed account of Consolidated's methods in exchange for a reduced sentence, which provided the investigators with enough to pursue the wider case aggressively. Calloway himself hired 3 lawyers and maintained his front porch hospitality and his patient, unhurried denials. But the documented pattern, Evelyn's work, mostly, the organized and dated and cross-referenced record she'd been building since November of the previous year, was not the kind of thing that lawyers dissolved easily. It was too specific, too complete, too carefully tied to physical evidence and corroborating witnesses. Bud Henderson, in one of his rare moments of expressiveness, looked at the binder of documentation that Evelyn brought to a meeting with the county authorities investigator and said, Lord above, woman, how long have you been carrying all this? Since October, she said. Bud looked at his wife. Nora Henderson looked at Evelyn the way women sometimes look at each other across a hard season of shared difficulty. Not sentiment exactly, but recognition. I want to learn how you do this, Nora said. Evelyn looked at her. I'll teach you. She meant it. Over the following weeks, she spent 3 afternoons at the Henderson place, showing Nora how she organized land documentation, what county records were available, and how to request them, and how to build a paper record that meant something when it needed to. Martha Trask came to 2 of those afternoons and took notes. Colt heard about this from Bud Henderson in town, not from Evelyn. Bud mentioned it in passing, the way men mention things they expect other men already know. That evening, Colt asked Evelyn about it. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing that?" he asked. "It didn't seem like ranch business," she said. "It seemed like something I was doing." "Those are our neighbors," he said. "What helps them helps us." "I know," she said. She stopped. It was rare for her to stop in the middle of a sentence, and he watched her work out whatever she was working out. "I'm not accustomed to reporting my movements," she said finally. "I've been on my own for a long time." Colt was quiet for a moment. He said, "So have I." They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the particular honesty of 2 people who have spent nearly a year in close proximity and who have, in the process of surviving difficulty together, become more transparent to each other than either of them had planned or expected. "I'd like to know," he said, "what you're doing, not to approve or disapprove. I'd just like to know." "All right," she said, "then I'll tell you." It was a small negotiation of the kind that happens between people building a shared life, the sort of moment that doesn't announce itself as significant, but is. They both knew it was. Neither of them made more of it than it was. The autumn cattle market vindicated Evelyn's breeding projections in a way that attracted attention well beyond Caldwell Flats. The Mercer Longhorn Cross yearlings, presented at the Harmon Market in October, drew 3 competing bids from purchasing agents representing operations in Kansas, Colorado, and the eastern markets. The animals came in at weight and condition that the agents hadn't expected from a ranch that had been quietly listed in their records as a marginal operation. Word moved through the market the way good news moves, faster than you'd think, and further. By the end of the market week, 2 neighboring ranches had approached Colt about the Garrison breeding program. He told them it was Evelyn's arrangement and suggested they talk to her. She negotiated consultation agreements with both of them. Not free advice, she'd learned from her father that knowledge given away at no cost tends to be valued at no cost, but structured agreements that provided the Mercer Ranch with a modest fee, and more importantly, with the beginning of a regional network of ranches using compatible methods and sharing market data. Colt watched this happen with the expression he'd developed over the months for when Evelyn did something he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't surprise anymore, exactly. It was more like the recognition of a pattern, the understanding that her reach was longer than what was immediately visible, that what looked like a single action was usually the visible part of a larger design. He told her one evening, not long after the market, that he thought she should write to Garrison about expanding the breeding contract. "I already have," she said. He looked at her. "I wrote him the week after the market," she said. "He's interested. I was going to show you the letter tonight." "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "I should have told you first." "Yes. I'm working on it," she said. He almost smiled. It was one of those almost smiles she'd learned to read as the real thing, the contained version of something he didn't quite let out. "I know you are," he said. The letter from Garrison, when she showed it to him, was promising enough to spend an hour on. They sat at the kitchen table and worked through what an expanded contract would mean. The capital required, the grazing capacity needed, how the North Ridge territory factored in if the boundary case resolved as expected. Evelyn had numbers for all of it. Colt had questions she'd anticipated and some she hadn't. At one point he pushed back on her projection for North Ridge carrying capacity, citing the soil conditions on the upper third of the ridge that he knew from 20 years of riding it. She listened. She looked at her notes. She said, "You're right, I've been using the survey averages, but the upper section won't carry what the lower does. That changes the third-year projection by about 15%. She corrected the numbers while he watched. "You actually change your mind when someone shows you you're wrong," he said. "Don't you?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I'm getting better at it," he said. She wrote the corrected projection. He kept his eyes on the page she was writing, and there was something in his expression that she didn't have a name for yet, but that had been there more often lately. Something that wasn't quite the recalibration look, and wasn't quite the almost smile, and was something else. Something she'd stopped trying to classify and had started simply letting be. The boundary resolution came through from the county authority on a Tuesday in November, just over a year after Evelyn had stepped off the stage in Caldwell Flats with 2 heavy trunks and a pair of reading spectacles pushed up on her forehead. The original survey was confirmed. The Mercer Ranch's eastern and northern boundary was restored to the 1847 measurement. 311 acres of high grazing territory on the North Ridge was formally returned to Mercer land. Delaney brought the papers out himself. He handed them to Colt in the yard and then, with the slight awkwardness of a man doing something that doesn't come naturally to him, he shook Evelyn's hand. "I've been doing this job for 12 years, he said. "I've never seen documentation put together the way you put it together. It made my job possible." "You moved when you had what you needed," she said. "That's what made it work." He nodded. He rode it back to town. The papers sat on the kitchen table between Colt and Evelyn while they stood in the kitchen looking at them. 311 acres, Colt said. "On the North Ridge," she said. "Summer range, high grass, good water." He picked up the papers. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at her. "You found this in February," he said. "I suspected it in December," she said. "I found it in February. I confirmed it in July." "You carried it for months." "Until I was sure," she said. "There was no point in telling you about something I might be wrong about." He set the papers down. He crossed the kitchen, and for a moment she didn't know what he was going to do. Colt Mercer was not a man who moved without purpose, and the purpose wasn't always legible. And then he put his hand out, not a handshake. Something between a handshake and not. His hand open, an offer. She took it. They stood like that for a moment in the kitchen of a house that had been cheerless when she arrived and was something else now. Not warm exactly. Nothing about the frontier was warm in November, but inhabited. Lived in. The house of people who had decided, not through sentiment but through repeated daily choice, to be in it together. "What do we do with it?" he asked. "The North Ridge land. The future of it." "We build something," she said, carefully, in the right sequence. "Your way." "Our way," she said. "You know this land. I know the methods. Neither of us has it without the other." He held her hand a moment longer than the agreement required. Then he said, "I'll ride the North Ridge tomorrow. You should come." "I'll be ready at sunrise," she said. He let go. He picked up the papers and put them in the documentation folder that lived on the shelf above the desk. Her shelf, though it had never been formally designated as such. And he went to see about the evening feeding. Evelyn stood at the kitchen table and looked at the folder on the shelf and felt something that wasn't triumph and wasn't relief and wasn't any of the things she'd expected to feel when things started to go right. It was quieter than any of those. More like the feeling of a foundation confirming that it will hold. Not exciting, not dramatic, just true. Outside the wind was doing what it did, testing the seams. The house held. It had been built solidly enough by people who knew what the winters required, and it held. They rode the North Ridge at sunrise, as agreed. The November light came in low and flat across the high ground, the kind of light that doesn't flatter anything but shows you exactly what is there. The grass on the restored territory was winter dry, pale, and pressed down by the season, but underneath it the soil was what Evelyn had read about in the survey documents and confirmed with her own hands in July. Deep, well-drained, the kind of ground that came back strong in spring because it had never been overworked. 311 acres of it, running along the ridge from the northeast corner down to where the original boundary marker had been moved by Pickett's fraudulent survey 12 years ago. Colt rode it without talking. Evelyn rode beside him and let him have the silence, because she understood by now that this was how he processed things that mattered, not by speaking about them, but by moving through them, feeling the ground under the horse, reading the land the way he'd been reading it since he was a boy, following his grandfather along these same fence lines. After 40 minutes, he stopped at the northeast corner, where the old boundary marker, a cairn of stacked stones that predated the Pickett survey, stood exactly where the county record said it would be. He looked at the cairn for a long time. "Harlan showed me this when I was 9, he said. He said the northeast corner was the best corner of the ranch. I asked him why. He said because it was the highest point, and from it you could see everything that needed protecting." He paused. 2 years later, Calloway's fences were pushed past it, and Harlan told me the surveyor had corrected an old error. I believed him. Harlan believed it too. Evelyn looked at the cairn. "He was deceived," she said. "The same as everyone else in the path of that program. He should have fought it. He didn't have what we had, she said. He didn't have the documentation. He didn't know what to look for. Colt was quiet. What made you look for it? She thought about how to answer that honestly. When I read the original surveys in St. Louis before I came here, I was trying to understand what the ranch was, what it had been. The boundary on the current county map didn't match the topographic description in the 1847 document. It was a small discrepancy. Probably most people who looked at it thought it was a drafting error. She paused. I thought it was a question. He turned and looked at her in the flat November light, and she looked back. And it was one of those moments between two people who have been through something difficult together, when the difficulty becomes briefly visible in its entirety. All the months of it, the cold and the debt, and the sabotage and the proving, and the slow, grinding work of building trust between two people who had been strangers forced into proximity. And then the moment passed, and they were just two people on horses on a ridge in November. A question, he said. Everything is a question until you find the answer, she said. Then it becomes a document. He almost smiled. The real version, not the contained one. It reached his eyes briefly, and then it was gone. He turned his horse back toward the ranch. Come on, he said. We have work to do. They always had work to do. That had not changed and would not change. But the nature of the work had shifted, and they both felt the shift in the way you feel a change in weather before it arrives. Not in any single thing, but in the quality of everything at once. The second winter on the Mercer Ranch was different from the first in ways that were practical and ways that were harder to name. The practical ways were visible and countable. The cattle numbers were up. The loan had been restructured in October on terms that gave them room to breathe. Not comfort exactly, but room. The North Ridge territory was formally Mercer land again, and Colt had already begun planning the spring fencing that would bring it into the rotation. The Garrison breeding contract had been expanded, and two of the neighboring ranches had entered into compatible programs that meant the Mercer cattle would have company in the regional market with ranches running similar stock, which mattered for pricing leverage in ways Evelyn had explained to Colt on 3 separate evenings using numbers and maps until he'd said, I understand it. You don't have to show me the arithmetic again. She'd shown him the arithmetic one more time. He'd let her. The ways that were harder to name were in the dailiness of two people who had stopped managing their coexistence and started simply living it. Colt had taken to leaving the ranch books on Evelyn's side of the desk at the end of the day, rather than his own, a small reallocation of territory that had happened without discussion. Evelyn had started asking his opinion on grazing decisions before finalizing them, not because she doubted her own analysis, but because his knowledge of the specific land, its moods, its history, the way particular sections behaved in particular conditions, was information she didn't have in any book and couldn't get from any survey. They'd discovered they were better together than either of them was alone, which sounds obvious, stated plainly, but is in practice one of the more difficult things two people can learn about each other because it requires a sustained willingness to be incomplete. The bunkhouse had changed too. Archie had left in September. Not fired, just gone, the way men go when the situation has stopped suiting them and they've got too much pride to adjust. He'd signed on with an outfit moving cattle up from Texas, and nobody had said much about his departure in either direction. Pete and Cal were solid. Deke had been given more responsibility and had grown into it without requiring anyone to manage the growth. Briggs remained Briggs, reliable as groundwater, just as invisible until you needed him. 2 new hands had been hired in the fall, young men from the eastern part of the territory who'd heard, through the specific word-of-mouth channel that operated among ranch workers, that the Mercer outfit was a place where the work was serious and the management knew what it was doing. They'd arrived expecting Colt to run the operation and had spent their first 2 weeks quietly recalibrating as they came to understand how decisions actually got made. Neither of them made an issue of it. The frontier was practical above all else, and the results of the Mercer Ranch's methods were plain enough that ideology didn't get much purchase. The federal investigation into Consolidated Western Holdings concluded its primary findings in the spring of the second year, and the results came down harder than even Evelyn had projected. Warren Stroud was charged with land fraud and conspiracy across 3 territories. His coordinated acquisition program, the one that had sent him to Colt's kitchen with his untouched coffee and his talk about the future of frontier ranching, had damaged 14 independent operations over 6 years, driving 4 of them into forced sale and holding 3 more in a state of deliberate distress. The documentation from the Mercer, Henderson, and Trask properties, along with Tully's detailed account and records the federal investigators recovered from Consolidated's own offices, built a case that the company's attorneys spent 4 months failing to dismantle. Calloway entered a settlement that stripped him of the fraudulently acquired grazing territories and imposed a financial penalty large enough to remove him as a competitive force in the region. He didn't go to prison. Men like Calloway rarely did, because men like Calloway could afford the particular quality of legal representation that turned criminal exposure into civil settlement. But he was finished in the territory, and he knew it, and the territory knew it. He sold his remaining legitimate land holdings by summer and relocated to Denver, which was where men went in that part of the world when they had run out of room. Delaney sent Evelyn a letter when the final settlement was announced. It was 3 sentences long, which for Delaney was essentially an oration. The investigation is concluded. The county authority has asked me to pass along their formal acknowledgement of the documentation provided by the Mercer Ranch. It made the difference. Evelyn folded the letter and put it in the evidence folder, which she then moved from the locked case under her desk to the regular shelf above it. She didn't need to lock it anymore. So, the conversation that changed things between them, the one that moved what they were to each other from partnership into something with a warmer and more honest name, happened on an ordinary evening in March, not during any particular crisis or resolution, which was perhaps why it happened at all. They'd been at the kitchen table after dinner, Evelyn working on the spring rotation schedule, and Colt going through correspondence. And Colt had opened a letter from a ranching association in Harmon, inviting the Mercer Ranch to send a representative to a regional land management conference in May. The letter was addressed to Mr. Colt Mercer, as most correspondence was, but the specific invitation was for a presentation on rotational grazing methods and water system restoration, methods that anyone in the territory who was paying attention knew had been Evelyn's work. Colt read it and put it on her side of the table without comment. She looked at it. She looked at him. "You should present," he said. "It's your work." "They addressed it to you." "They addressed it to the ranch," he said. "It's your work." She set down her pen. "Are you sure?" "I'd make a poor presentation," he said. "I know what we did. I don't know how to explain why it works to people who haven't seen it. I could teach you." "You could," he said, "or you could just go and do it correctly the first time." She looked at him for a moment. I was reading the next letter in the stack with the focused, slightly impatient expression he wore when he was being matter-of-fact about something he'd already decided. "Colt," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said. Not for the conference, or not only for that. He understood the scope of it. She could see that he understood. He held her look for a beat. Then he said, "Don't thank me. You've been doing the work. I've just been paying attention." She picked up her pen. She looked at the rotation schedule. She put the pen down again. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When I came here, I expected to be useful. I planned for that. What I didn't plan for was—" She stopped, started again. "I've been alone since my father died. Not unhappily. I made a life. But alone in the way that you stop expecting anyone to see what you see or to value what you've learned. You just do the work, and it's enough, and you stop thinking about whether anyone is watching." He said nothing. He was very still in the particular way that meant he was listening at full depth. "You watch," she said. "You've been watching since November. And you adjust when I'm right, and you push back when I'm wrong, and you—" She stopped again. "I'm not good at this," she said. "Saying things that aren't operational." "You're doing fine," he said quietly. She looked at her hands on the table. "I'm glad he left me the ranch," she said. "Harlan, I'm glad he wrote it the way he did." Colt was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the spring wind moved against the house, lighter than the winter wind, carrying something green in it. Inside, the lamp burned steady, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the correspondence was spread across the table, and the rotation schedule was half finished, and the whole ordinary reality of a shared life was arranged around them, like furniture that had finally been put in the right places. "I owe you an apology," he said, "a real one. Not what I said in January when I said I hadn't made things easy. That was true, but it wasn't enough. Colt, let me say it," he said. I treated you like a problem my grandfather left me. I was wrong about that before you'd been here a week, and I knew it, and I kept acting on the wrong assumption because changing it meant admitting how wrong I'd been. He paused. You deserved better than that from the start. The kitchen was very quiet. We got here, she said finally. We did, he said. But I want you to know I understand what it cost you to get here when I wasn't making it easy. She looked at him across the table. This man who had shaken her hand at a gate like a business transaction and eaten her food without warmth for weeks and slowly, stubbornly, completely changed. Not because she'd demanded it or argued for it, but because she'd been consistently, undeniably present, and presence had done what argument never could. It costs less than you think, she said. I'm harder to discourage than most people expect. I know that now, he said. You knew it in November, she said. I saw it in your face when you came back from the north section the first time. He almost smiled. Maybe I did, he said. Didn't know what to do with it. And now? He looked at her steadily. Now I know exactly what to do with it, he said. He reached across the table. Not a handshake this time. He'd done that in November, and it had been the right gesture for November, formal and honest and tentative. This was his hand open on the table beside her work, an offering without terms attached, and she put her hand in it, and they sat like that in the lamplight with the spring wind moving against the house, and all the unfinished work between them on the table, and it was enough. More than enough. Hush. The Mercer Ranch presented at the Harmon Regional Conference in May, and Evelyn spoke for 40 minutes to a room of 63 ranchers, land managers, county officials, and 2 representatives from a federal agricultural bureau who had traveled from the territorial capital specifically because of the written summary she'd submitted in advance. She was not a natural public speaker in the way that people who perform ease are natural public speakers. She was direct. She was precise. She used no more words than the subject required, and she did not perform confidence she didn't have or soften conclusions that were uncomfortable. When a rancher in the third row challenged her water restoration claims as inconsistent with his experience in a different soil type, she asked him 3 questions about his specific conditions, incorporated his answer into her analysis on the spot, and told him he was correct that the method would need modification in his context. And here was why, and here was what she'd suggest instead. The room's quality of attention changed after that. It was the specific shift that happens when people stop evaluating a speaker and start actually listening, because they've decided the speaker is worth their full attention. She answered questions for another 30 minutes after the formal presentation. Colt, who had come with her and sat in the back row, watched this happen with his arms crossed and an expression that he hadn't bothered to make neutral because he wasn't performing anything for anyone. On the road home, she asked him how she'd done. You know how you did, he said. I'm asking what you thought. He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. That man in the third row, the one who challenged the water restoration data. Benwick, she said, his soil type is different. He was right to push back. Most people would have defended the presentation, Colt said. You incorporated him. He had useful information, she said. Why would I waste it? He shook his head slowly. Not disagreement, more like someone who keeps encountering the same thing and keeps finding it worth remarking on. That's why the room listened to you, he said, not because you were right, because you were honest about what you didn't know. She thought about this. My father said the most trustworthy thing a person can do is accurately describe the edges of what they understand. It tells people where the solid ground ends, and they can make their own decisions about the rest. Colt thought about that for a mile or so. Then he said, Your father sounds like someone I'd have liked. He'd have liked you too, she said. He respected people who were honest about their stubbornness. Colt laughed. A real one, the full version, without the usual containment. And she felt it in her chest the way you feel the first warm day after a long winter. Not dramatic, just suddenly, undeniably present. The years that followed were not a simple ascent. There is no such thing in ranching or anywhere else, and anyone who tells you otherwise has never worked land through a drought year or buried cattle in a hard winter, or watched a market collapse take 2 seasons of work down to a fraction of its value overnight. The Mercer Ranch had all of those things in various combinations over the years that followed that second spring. What was different was the way they met each difficulty. Not without strain. They fought sometimes, the way two competent people fight when they disagree about something they both care about, and neither of them is wrong enough to concede easily. Colt had a tendency to act before fully consulting her when speed felt urgent, and Evelyn had a tendency to research longer than the situation allowed when the uncertainty made her want more data before committing. These tendencies created friction that didn't resolve, it just got managed better over time. But when a problem arrived, the cattle disease that came through the territory in the 4th year and killed a third of their breeding stock before a treatment regimen could be established, the water dispute with a new neighbor who hadn't been briefed on the history of the eastern boundary and had to be educated through 18 months of documentation and 2 county hearings, the market crash of the 6th year that cut cattle prices across the territory by 40% and required a complete restructuring of their expansion plans. They met each one together. Not always smoothly, not always in agreement at the start, but together. The North Ridge came fully into production in the 3rd year, the spring grass exactly as deep and strong as Evelyn had read in the original survey documents, and the carrying capacity it added to the ranch made the Garrison breeding program viable at a scale neither she nor the rancher himself had originally projected. By the 5th year, Garrison had started calling the cattle that came out of the Mercer breeding program by their own informal name, Mercer Cross, because buyers in 3 states had started asking for them specifically. Evelyn learned about this from Garrison's letter. She read it at the kitchen table and set it down and didn't say anything for a moment. "What?" Colt asked. He'd learned to read the particular quality of her silence. "He's calling them Mercer Cross," she said. Colt picked up the letter and read that section. He put it back down. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's just—" She stopped, started again. "When I left St. Louis, I thought the best I could hope for was to be useful enough that people stopped being surprised I was there." He looked at her. "That's not where we are anymore," she said. "No," he said, "it isn't." She folded the letter and put it in the correspondence file. She went back to the rotation schedule she'd been working on. He watched her work for a moment, the focused, unhurried precision of someone doing something they know well, and then he went back to his own work. And the kitchen was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that belongs to people who are comfortable in the same silence. The town of Caldwell Flats changed its relationship to Evelyn Mercer. The way towns change their minds about people they were wrong about. Not all at once, not with acknowledgement of the error, but gradually and practically, expressed through the small transactions of daily life rather than any formal revision. The women who had whispered on the street the morning she arrived began, over the years, to stop for conversation when she came to town. Not effusively. Evelyn didn't inspire effusiveness, and she didn't want it. But genuinely, with the specific quality of attention that means a person has something real to discuss and believes you'll engage with it seriously. Henry Prewitt at the bank began consulting her informally on land management questions from other clients, framed carefully as hypothetical but transparently practical. She answered the hypotheticals without making it uncomfortable for either of them. The Ranching Association in Harmon asked her to speak at the conference 3 years running, and in the 4th year asked her to join their land management committee, which she did on the condition that the committee's recommendations be grounded in documented outcomes rather than received tradition. The chairman had said, with the slight resignation of a man who knew he was getting what he needed rather than what he'd expected, "Mrs. Mercer, I wouldn't have it any other way." She'd made that condition not to be difficult, but because she'd watched tradition without evidence drive too much bad decision-making to leave it unaddressed. This was one of the things about her that hadn't changed. The insistence that conclusions be earned, that the evidence come before the certainty, that the document precede the claim. It made her occasionally uncomfortable to be around for people who preferred their assumptions undisturbed. She'd stopped apologizing for it by the 3rd year, if she'd ever really started. Nora Henderson had become something close to a friend. Not the easy kind, but the durable kind, built on shared work and genuine respect, and the specific bond of having been through a difficult period in proximity. They met every few weeks, and Evelyn had taught Nora not just the documentation methods, but the land survey reading and the water management principles. And Nora had turned out to have a particular talent for the survey work that Evelyn told her, directly, she should develop further. "I'm a rancher's wife," Nora said, the first time Evelyn said this. "You're a person with a skill," Evelyn said. "The rancher's wife part is true too, but it's not the ceiling." Nora looked at her for a long moment. Did someone say that to you once? My father, Evelyn said. Not in those words, but yes. Nora nodded slowly. She went back to the survey documents. She got better, steadily and without fanfare, and in the 5th year she testified before the county authority on a boundary dispute involving 3 properties, and her testimony was accurate, organized, and completely convincing. Evelyn sat in the back of the hearing room and watched this happen, and felt something that was distinct from pride but related to it, the satisfaction of seeing something you believed in confirmed by the world. Briggs retired in the 7th year. He was 63 years old, and his knees had been complaining since the 4th year. And he'd been ignoring them with the stubborn patience he applied to everything. But that winter he told Colt he was going to spend some time in the South and see if the warmer climate helped. They gave him a party in the bunkhouse, which was something they'd never done before for anyone. And Briggs sat through it with the expression of a man enduring something he found unnecessary, but wasn't ungrateful for. He shook hands with all the hands, and then he came to Evelyn and stood in front of her and said, You know when you started to win them over, that day in the South Pasture Channel, when you told Archie to dig it your way or explain it to Colt? They were all watching, every man there. I remember, she said. You didn't flinch, he said. That's what they were watching for, to see if you'd flinch. I was frightened, she said. I know, he said. That's the point. He put out his hand. She shook it. He said, You're good for this land. Both of you together. Harlan knew. He left the next morning before anyone else was up, which was exactly how she'd expected him to go. The evening after Briggs left, Colt and Evelyn sat on the porch in the late autumn dark, which was something they'd taken to doing in the years since the 2nd winter. Not every evening, not ceremonially, but when the day was done and the house was quiet and the night was clear enough to see the high country to the north. The North Ridge was visible on clear nights, a dark rise against the sky. Evelyn had never stopped looking at it with a particular quality of attention. She knew every section of it by now. She'd ridden it in every season and in varying conditions, and she'd watched the grass come back across it in the 3rd year with the feeling of something confirmed that she'd believed without being certain, which was always the best kind of confirmation. Briggs said you started to win them over that day in the channel, Colt said. He told you. Just now when I walked him to his horse. Colt looked at the ridge. I was there that day. I heard it. I didn't understand what I was watching. You weren't watching for the same thing they were, she said. What were you watching for? He was quiet for a moment. Whether you'd break, he said. I'm not proud of that. You'd have been irrational not to wonder, she said. Everything in your experience said I should have broken by then. Everything in my experience was wrong about you, he said. She didn't answer that. The night was cold and clear and very still, and the North Ridge held its dark shape against the sky, and somewhere in the distance a coyote said something and was answered. I've been thinking about something, she said. What? The Trask boys. Martha's sons. The younger one, Daniel. He's been talking to Pete about land management. He wants to learn the methods. Martha mentioned it. You want to take him on? As an apprentice, essentially. He's 22. He's got a good mind, and he's not afraid of documentation. She paused. There are going to be more ranches like ours in this territory if the methods spread the way they're spreading. Someone needs to be trained in the full system, not just the pieces. Colt looked at her. You're thinking past us. I'm always thinking past us, she said. That's how things last. He was quiet for a long while. The coyote had stopped. The stars were very clear. All right, he said. Talk to Martha. If the boy is willing to work the way we work, he can start in spring. She nodded. She looked at the ridge. Colt, she said. Yeah. Do you remember what you said in that lawyer's office? When you first read your grandfather's will? He thought about it. I said he'd left me a bride. Do you remember what Herschel said? He was quiet. He said he'd left me the ranch. The bride was the condition. Herschel had it backward, Evelyn said. Colt turned and looked at her in the dark. The ranch was the condition, she said. I was the gift. He looked at her for a long moment. The night was still, and the North Ridge was there where it had always been, returned to them. And the land below it was not what it had been when she arrived. It was something built, carefully and in the right sequence, over years of unglamorous, persistent work. You're not wrong, he said quietly. You're usually not wrong. Usually, she said. The South Barn, he said. Don't forget the South Barn. She almost laughed. A real one, surprised out of her. I've documented the South Barn error in my records as a lesson on underestimating material conditions. Of course you have, he said. They sat in the dark a while longer. Not talking, not needing to. The kind of silence that is possible between two people who have been through enough together that silence has stopped being absence and become something solid. There's a thing that happens to people who stay with what is hard, not because they have no other choice, but because they've decided the thing is worth the difficulty. It doesn't feel like triumph when it happens. It doesn't feel like anything dramatic at all. It feels like the North Ridge in the morning light, ordinary, present, and solid all the way down. Evelyn Mercer had come to this ranch as a condition of a will, the woman everyone in Caldwell Flats had already decided was wrong for the place. Wrong in her body, wrong in her background, wrong in the particular way that people decide things are wrong before they've looked carefully. She had not arrived with the intention of proving anything to anyone. She had arrived with 2 heavy trunks, a set of survey documents she'd requested months before she knew she'd need them, and the deeply practical conviction that the question was never what they thought of you, but what you were going to build. She'd built something. They'd built something. She and this stubborn, honest, gradually humbled man who had needed a year to understand what his grandfather had understood from the outside in a moment. What Harlan Mercer had seen in Theodore Ashford's daughter was not what the town of Caldwell Flats had seen. He'd seen what Evelyn had been all her life, beneath and beyond everything else. Someone who looked at a problem and saw, not an obstacle, but a question waiting for its answer. The questions never stopped coming. That was the nature of land, of work, of 2 people building a life in difficult country. But neither did the answers, steady and documented and earned. Outside Caldwell Flats, on a ridge the county survey now correctly identified as the northeast corner of the Mercer Ranch, the grass would come back in spring as it had come back every spring since Evelyn redirected the water, and it would be deep and strong and carry what needed carrying through another season. That was enough.